Hi, I'm here to talk to you about social media and what effect it has on an individual's mental state, as well as to see if any individual's daily habits change due to social media. Take a minute to think about how many of you have social media on your devices. Now think about, do you spend more time on it than you should daily? Because of this, have you noticed a significant difference in your mental health state, daily habits, or everyday life? You aren't alone, and this isn't a rare situation. Technology has become such a dependent part of society's everyday life that it's almost impossible to avoid it. Especially with the current worldwide situation, people really depend on social media more now than ever to keep as well as make new connections. And it's easy to get caught up in mindlessly scrolling. Even I will admit that I am on social media more than I should be. And I have noticed that it has affected my mental state before in the past, as well as it affecting my daily habits and routine. It definitely makes me procrastinate more. I'm not as efficient and motivated. And I'm sure that's the case for a lot of people. It doesn't help either that there are so many types of social media. There's Instagram, there's Twitter, there's YouTube, there's Pinterest, Snapchat, Facebook, the list goes on. This century has also made a habit of using these platforms to spread news and media, which also doesn't help us moderate our time on it. Even before the pandemic, I noticed people around me, including myself, avoid simple and potentially awkward situations. People would directly go down to looking at their phone and scrolling, opposed to simple eye contact and face-to-face interaction. Whether we realize it or not, social interaction is quite essential, and I feel as though due to the world circumstance that we can realize how true that actually is. Lack of social interaction and communication with one another can cause negative effects on one's mental state and daily life, and that's just one of the negative aspects. It all ties in with technology and social media platforms. Mindlessly scrolling all day and seeing what appears to be the perfect life of others can cause serious mental damage to an individual, some social media more than others. With all of this, I wanted to study into my hypothesis, which is if social media did indeed cause some or many negative effects on an individual's psychological. I participated in a year-long research project collecting scholarly sources with studies that furthered into this topic. I used the data from the studies that I collected to form my own research conclusion on the topic, which I will describe more into my presentation. Aforementioned in my introduction, I discussed the topic of social media and how I wanted to see if those platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, YouTube, Facebook, etc. had any effect on an individual's psyche. As I explored this study, I found an abundance of different scholarly sources, as well as individual studies that investigated into different forms of seeing if social media had negative effects on an individual, as well as communicational. In one of my scholarly sources, Briloviskia did a study on the relationship between personality and mental health due to different forms of social media. This study was held by German students, which we can conclude that this topic and issue doesn't pertain to just one demographic, but it is worldwide. In this study, it was shown that participants that had a higher usage of social media and technology also seemed to have higher values of self-esteem, narcissism, life satisfaction, resilience, and social support than others. Results indicated a positive association between general internet usage as well as social media use. In another study conducted by Coin, it was further looked into the time usage of social media and one's mental state with depression and anxiety. Participants of ages 13 to 20 gave annual reflections on their mental state on a span of 8 years. Results from this study showed that social media time usage didn't have effect on one's depression levels, but did in fact have higher anxiety levels on individuals. In Morgan and Cotton's study, it was more based around looking into the communicational aspect of usage of social media. Morgan and Cotton found a study that the more frequent people were using technology for entertainment or hobbies opposed to face-to-face interaction had higher depressional levels. In a Luterized study, they further discovered the details in how social media affects teens' identity, emerging sexuality, physique, moral consciousness, identity construction, sexuality, and relationships. Social media was shown to affect an individual's decision-making skills as well as affecting their mental state. Social networks were known to evoke anxiety, low self-esteem, and depressional issues as well, especially with teenagers, since it was already shown that they were already figuring out their identity. They also stated that social networks can tend to increase risk-taking attitudes and related behaviors. Research also shows social media has a worsening negative impact on those with experience of prior mental health issues. Even though I collected a numerous amount of scholarly sources, I was curious and I decided to conduct my own little bit of personal research, and I took the initiative to ask my own followers and peers on my social media platforms 2 questions. 1, has social media had a negative effect on you, your mental health state, or your daily habits? And the second question was, how much time do you spend on social media daily? The results for the first question were anticipated but still surprising. As you can see, 84% of my followers said yes to observing that social media had a negative effect on them and their mental health or their daily habits. Meanwhile, the other 16% said no. As you can see, the ratio for individuals that are self-aware that social media does have an impact on them, their mental health state, or their daily habits in some sort of way is superior to the individuals that replied no. For the results to my second question were astonishing. I took some screenshots of some replies that I got to the second question that I asked, and I put them all up on here. I wanted to still incorporate their personalities, so thus why there are emojis. Results from different individuals varied from 1 to 15 hours spent on social media daily. One can predict that those numbers have increased due to everything moving online due to the world circumstance. This chart is just a visual comparison for the previous studies that I have talked about in this presentation. A couple things that I want to point out. The numbers that are on this chart, each study used different metrics and don't directly correlate to one another. However, this chart does, I just wanted to show general increase and decrease for each variable. I would also like to point out, I did previously talk about 4 studies, and there are only 3 on this chart, but these 3 had very similar outcomes, whereas Viskia and her results were actually positive, whereas these had more negative results. Thus why I only put these in the graph. As you can see, within a Luterized study, levels of depression and anxiety were very apparent. They were very high, opposed to self-esteem and comparison issues or communicational. For Cohen's study, same with the Luterized, anxiety and depression made an appearance. However, as you can see by the chart, the variable of anxiety was significantly higher than the levels of depression found in the study. And for Morgan and Cotton's study, all 3 variables of depression, anxiety, self-esteem, and comparison issues were apparent. However, depression was significantly higher opposed to anxiety and self-esteem and comparison issues, but the self-esteem issues were a close second. I also wanted to elaborate that the section on the graph of communication issues, each study pertained to initially looking into the communicational aspect of the usage of social media. However, these are the results that they got: depression, anxiety, and self-esteem comparison issues. As you can see, the abundance of evidence pertaining to social media's effect on the mental state is astonishing. My hypothesis from the beginning was that social media does indeed have a negative effect on an individual's psyche. Of the different sources with different studies, all of them had one common factor, and that social media had a trigger on some sort of negative aspect, such as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, and self-comparison issues, as well as affecting communicational skills and relationships with others. Anxiety had appeared multiple times in different studies and showed increasingly concerning numbers. We can also gather that this issue was global and not pertaining to one certain demographic, not to mention that the effects spiral into more than just the psychological aspect, but communicatively as well. Limitations include that the data collected were all studies taken before COVID. So one can conclude that the data represented individuals with or without a steady mental health state. The data may vary to those within the current state of individuals due to the worldwide pandemic. The studies I have shown today are applicable to participants before COVID, but data post-COVID is uncertain. However, we can assume that the usage of social media has increased and people's mental health state is declining. From this, one could continue this study in the near future and gather more up-to-date data that show potential increases in negative effects due to social media usage on one's mental health state due to COVID. Suggested topics for the next steps to further this study into this subject would be to gather and conduct studies, if this has not already been started, on participants affected due to COVID with a range of individuals that are greatly and not so greatly affected. Another step is to see how, if there are any new negative effects due to high social media usage on an individual's mental state being housebound due to COVID. For this year-long project, I took on the subject of social media and the effects that it had on an individual's mental health state. I hypothesized that social media caused negative consequence on individuals mentally as well as communicatively. After researching and finding multiple studies on the matter and evidence that I have provided with you today, my hypothesis was correct. The next part of my goal was to find what negative mental aspects social media caused, and I found that common ones are what I expected, such as anxiety, depression, and self-comparison issues. With all of this information that I have presented to you today, I ask you now to look at yourself and your life to see if social media has had the same impact that it has on the individuals taken in these studies. Are you aware that it's negatively affecting you, your mental health state, your daily habits, or life in some sort of way, shape, or form? And if so, don't stop there. Self-awareness is just one step, but I challenge you to see if you have the discipline to make the changes in your life for a better outcome. If you are more interested into looking into what I have presented with you today, these are the links to the sources and studies that I have mentioned in this presentation, and you can go and further examine it for yourself if you wish. Thank you.